Welcome to the Sleep Wizard's Library. I'm Emma Brooks, and I'll be here with you for the next little while. As you listen, there's nothing you need to do, nothing you need to hold on to. This story is meant to be experienced slowly, the way night itself unfolds. You can let your breathing soften, your thoughts drift where they want to go, and allow the words to meet you wherever you are. Whenever you're ready, the story can begin. The Princes and the Pea. The kingdom of Oakhaven did not announce itself with the blare of golden trumpets or the ostentatious display of banners snapping in the wind. It was a realm of soft edges and deep contemplative silences, where the moss grew thick upon the ancient stones of the citadel, and the rivers moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a shared secret. The castle itself, a labyrinth of gray granite and polished cedar, seemed to lean into the hillside as if listening to the heartbeat of the earth. Inside these walls, the air was perpetually cool, scented with the faint, lingering ghosts of dried lavender and beeswax. It was a place of high refinement, of tapestries that told stories of forgotten saints, and of clocks that ticked with a rhythmic gravity that made every passing second feel like an inheritance. The halls stretched endlessly into shadow, lined with portraits of ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to follow the living with expressions of knowing melancholy. Each corridor was a study in controlled beauty, where even the dust motes that drifted through the slanted afternoon light appeared to move with intention. The gardens that surrounded the castle were maintained with the precision of a monastery, where every hedge was trimmed to geometric perfection and every rosebush bloomed according to an ancient schedule passed down through generations of gardeners. Yet, for all its curated beauty and historical weight, a profound and quiet melancholy had taken root in the halls of Oakhaven. It was not the sharp grief of loss, but rather the dull ache of unfulfilled potential, the sense that the kingdom was waiting for something it could not name. The courtiers moved through their days with the mechanical precision of the castle clocks, their conversations following scripts that had been refined over centuries. The seasonal festivals were observed with dutiful accuracy but little joy, as if the kingdom itself had forgotten what it meant to celebrate rather than simply perform. At the center of this stillness lived Prince Elian. He was a man who had reached the age where the world no longer felt infinite, but rather like a series of rooms through which he had walked without ever finding a reason to stay. Elian was not a creature of the hunt or the raucous banquet hall. He was a creature of the library and the high, lonely balconies that looked out over the mist-shrouded valleys of his heritage. His childhood had been spent in the company of tutors who taught him not just the languages of neighboring kingdoms, but the dialects of philosophy and poetry. He had learned to read the sky for weather and the faces of courtiers for deception. He had been trained in diplomacy and statecraft, in the arts of war and the graces of peace, but no one had taught him how to silence the constant, critical voice in his own mind that whispered that everything around him was a carefully constructed facade. As a young man, Elian had thrown himself into the pursuit of knowledge, spending days in the library archives studying manuscripts that crumbled at his touch. He had learned the history of kingdoms that had risen and fallen before Oakhaven existed, and he had read the philosophical treatises of thinkers who questioned the nature of reality itself. The more he learned, the more he realized that the refined world of the court was built on a foundation of agreed-upon fictions, and this realization had left him feeling increasingly isolated from those around him. For years, he had traveled to the furthest reaches of the known maps, crossing oceans that churned like boiling lead and traversing deserts, where the heat turned the horizon into a shimmering, deceptive liquid. He had been searching for a princess, or so the courtly songs would have it. But in the private chambers of his own mind, Elian knew he was searching for something far rarer. He was searching for a quality of being that he could only describe as truth. His journeys had taken him to the marble palaces of the southern empires, where the architecture seemed to defy gravity and the courtyards were filled with fountains that sang in harmonies no human voice could replicate. He had visited the fortress cities of the mountain kingdoms, where the air was so thin that every breath felt like a conscious act of survival. He had sailed to the island nations where the people lived in harmony with the tides, their entire culture built around the rhythm of the sea. He had met many women who wore the title of princess as if it were a heavy velvet cloak. They were daughters of emperors, heirs to sprawling trade routes and iron mines, women whose lineages were as impeccable as the diamonds they wore at their throats. They spoke the languages of diplomacy and the dialects of the drawing room. They moved with the practiced elegance of those who have been watched since birth. Some were brilliant conversationalists who could debate philosophy with the same ease. They discussed the latest fashions from the continental ateliers. Others were accomplished musicians or painters, their talents honed through years of private instruction from the finest masters their father's gold could acquire. But when Elian looked into their eyes, he found only the reflection of his own expectations. There was a performative quality to their grace, a sense that they were playing the role of a sovereign because the script demanded it. They were princesses by decree, by blood and by jewelry, but none of them seemed to possess that innate, vibrating sensitivity that Elian believed was the true mark of a soul attuned to the universe. He had watched them navigate the elaborate dances of state dinners, their smiles never wavering even when the conversation turned to topics that should have provoked emotion or at least genuine interest. He had observed the way they received compliments with rehearsed modesty and deflected criticism with diplomatic deflection. They were masters of the surface, experts in the art of being what others expected, but he could find no evidence of the raw, vulnerable authenticity he craved. He returned to Oakhaven not with a bride, but with an exhaustion that sat behind his ribs like a cold stone. The journey home had been long and solitary, giving him ample time to reflect on the futility of his search and the growing suspicion that what he sought might not exist. He had stood on the deck of the ship that carried him across the final stretch of sea, watching the familiar cliffs of his homeland emerge from the morning mist, and he had felt not relief but a deepening sense of resignation. His mother, the Queen, watched him with a quiet, observant sorrow. She was a woman of immense internal architecture, possessing a mind that functioned like a masterfully crafted clockwork mechanism. She had married the king not for love, though affection had grown between them over time, but because she recognized in him a man who would give her the freedom to shape the intellectual and cultural life of the kingdom. She had spent her marriage building a court that valued thought over spectacle, creating a sanctuary for artists and philosophers who found the louder kingdoms exhausting. She understood her son's longing because she had spent her life cultivating her own discernment. To the Queen, royalty was not a matter of power or wealth, but a refinement of the senses, a way of perceiving the world's hidden textures. She could tell the quality of silk by the sound it made when it moved, and she could judge the character of a diplomat by the specific pattern of their evasions. She had built her reputation on the ability to see through pretense, and she had hoped to pass this gift to her son, though now she wondered if she had instead cursed him with a sensitivity that made happiness impossible. She saw Elian's withdrawal into the shadows of the castle as a form of mourning for a world that felt increasingly coarse and superficial. She watched him spend his days in the high tower rooms, reading books he had already read a dozen times or standing at windows that looked out at landscapes he could have described with his eyes closed. She saw the way he moved through the castle like a ghost, present but not truly inhabiting the space, and her heart ached with the particular pain of a parent who recognizes their child's suffering but does not know how to alleviate it. They sat together in the evenings, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows against the walls, rarely speaking but sharing the heavy weight of the castle's refined loneliness. The Queen would work on her embroidery, creating elaborate tapestries that depicted scenes from the kingdom's mythology, while Elian would sit with a book open in his lap, his eyes focused on the flames rather than the page. Sometimes she would ask him about his travels, and he would offer brief descriptions of the places he had seen, but his voice would carry no enthusiasm, only the flat recitation of facts observed by a weary chronicler. The king was a distant figure of duty, preoccupied with the mechanics of the state, leaving the prince and the queen to inhabit the emotional landscape of the interior. He was not an unkind man, but rather one whose mind was entirely consumed by the practical demands of governance, the management of trade agreements, the negotiation of border disputes, the careful balancing of noble factions. He loved his wife and son in his own way, but he could not understand the refined sensibilities that made them suffer in ways he found incomprehensible. To him, a bed was a place to sleep, and if the mattress was soft and the room warm, that was all that mattered. He could not fathom why his son would return from meeting a dozen eligible princesses without choosing even one. The seasons in Oakhaven had begun to blur into a singular gray continuum until the night of the Great Deluge arrived to break the spell. The summer had been unusually dry, with the gardens requiring constant irrigation and the wells dropping to levels that concerned even the optimistic groundskeepers. The farmers in the surrounding valleys had watched the sky with increasing anxiety, knowing that their harvest depended on rains that refused to come. The air had grown thick and oppressive, carrying a charge that made the horses restless in their stables and caused the castle dogs to whine without apparent cause. It began not with a sudden crack of thunder, but with an atmospheric shift, a tightening of the air that made the hounds in the courtyard whine in their sleep. The sky, which had been a dull pewter throughout the afternoon, deepened into a bruised, violent violet before finally surrendering to a total, impenetrable black. The birds that had been singing in the gardens fell silent all at once, and even the insects seemed to pause in their endless droning. The castle servants, who had been going about their evening duties, found themselves stopping mid-task to stare out windows at the gathering darkness. Then the rain began. It was not a storm that merely visited the kingdom, it was a storm that laid siege to it. The water fell in solid, relentless sheets, turning the manicured gardens into muddy lagoons and the mountain paths into treacherous cataracts. The carefully tended flower beds were flattened within minutes, their delicate blooms beaten into the earth by the sheer force of the downpour. The fountains in the courtyards overflowed, their basins unable to contain the volume of water that poured from the sky, and soon the lower terraces were awash with streams that carved new channels through the gravel paths. The wind howled through the battlements, a primal, wordless scream that seemed to challenge the very foundations of the castle. It tore at the shutters and rattled the ancient iron hinges, finding its way through cracks in the stonework that had remained sealed for decades. The tapestries in the great hall began to sway and billow, animated by drafts that should not have been able to penetrate the thick walls. The servants rushed to secure windows and reinforce doors, their movements quick and efficient despite the growing sense of unease. In his high chamber, Elian watched the lightning illuminate the world in brief, strobe-like flashes, revealing a landscape that looked alien and hostile under the electric glare. He saw the ancient oaks in the forest bending nearly horizontal under the force of the wind, their branches whipping like the tentacles of some vast, angry creature. He saw the river that ran through the valley swelling beyond its banks, claiming territory it had not touched in living memory. The storm felt like a judgment, a cosmic response to the stagnant melancholy that had settled over the kingdom, and Elian found himself transfixed by its raw power. For the first time in months, he felt something approaching emotion, a stirring in his chest that was part fear and part exhilaration. It was in the very teeth of this tempest that a knocking began at the great outer gate. It was a sound that should have been swallowed by the roar of the wind, yet it reached the ears of the gatekeepers and the queen herself, with a strange, insistent clarity like a pebble dropped into a deep well. The guards looked at each other with expressions of disbelief, uncertain whether they had truly heard the sound or merely imagined it. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, a steady rhythm that cut through the chaos of the storm with uncanny precision. The captain of the guard approached the heavy wooden doors with his hand on the pommel of his sword, his mind racing through the possibilities. No one traveled on a night like this unless driven by desperation or madness, and either option presented potential dangers to the household. The heavy iron-studded doors were unbarred with a groan of protesting metal, and into the flickering torchlight of the entry hall stepped a solitary figure. She was a woman, though at first glance she seemed more like a specter of the storm itself. She was drenched to the bone, her clothes clinging to her frame like a second, darker skin. Water cascaded from the hem of her travel-worn cloak, forming a dark, spreading pool on the polished marble floor. Her hair, the color of wet earth, was plastered across her forehead and cheeks, and her boots were caked with the thick, gray clay of the valley paths. She carried no bag, no visible possessions save for the ruined clothes on her back, and there was no horse or carriage waiting in the courtyard behind her. She stood there, shivering with a violence that made her teeth chatter. Yet there was no panic in her posture, only a profound, exhausted presence, Her eyes, dark and bright in the torchlight, swept across the gathered guards, with a look that was neither pleading nor defiant, but simply observant. When the guards approached her, their hands hovering near the hilts of their swords, she looked up, and for a moment, the entire hall seemed to fall into a vacuum of silence. "I am a princess," she said, her voice thin and raspy from the cold, but carrying a cadence that bypassed the ears and struck something deep in the chest. The guards looked at one another with ill-disguised skepticism. To them, she looked like a vagabond, a traveler who had lost her way or her mind, a common girl who had invented a title to secure a warm hearth for the night. There were no attendants, no horses, no gilded carriages waiting in the rain behind her. There was only the howling wind and the vast, uncaring darkness of the storm. One of the younger guards actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief that echoed off the stone walls before being silenced by a sharp look from his captain. The captain himself regarded the girl with a mixture of pity and suspicion, his hand still resting on his sword as he tried to determine whether she represented a threat or merely a nuisance. The queen descended the grand staircase with a slow, regal deliberation, her silk gown whispering against the stone steps like a falling leaf. She had been in her chambers when the knocking began, but some instinct had drawn her from her solitude, a curiosity that she could not name but trusted implicitly. She did not speak immediately, but stood at a distance, surveying the girl with eyes that had spent decades stripping away facades. She saw the mud, the shivering limbs, and the ruined clothes. But she also saw the way the girl held her head, and the way her gaze remained steady even as the cold threatened to break her. The queen had attended enough state functions and diplomatic receptions to recognize the difference between learned poise and inherent dignity, and this girl, despite her bedraggled appearance, carried herself with a quality that could not be taught in any finishing school. The queen knew that the storm was a great equalizer, that it could strip a queen of her dignity and a peasant of his pride, leaving behind only the raw material of the human spirit. She had seen nobles reduced to whimpering children by far lesser hardships, and she had witnessed commoners face adversity with grace that put royalty to shame. The external markers of status meant nothing in the face of genuine character, and the queen had built her life on the principle that true nobility was a quality of perception rather than a fact of birth. "She says she is a princess," the captain of the guard said, his voice tinged with a weary irony. The queen tilted her head, her expression unreadable in the amber glow of the torches. "Many things are said in the dark," the queen replied softly, "but the truth has a way of revealing itself when the world is quiet." She studied the girl for a long moment, taking in details that the guards had missed in their quick assessment. She noticed the quality of the fabric beneath the mud, the fine weave that spoke of skilled craftsmen and expensive materials. She observed the girl's hands, which, despite being raw from cold and travel, bore no calluses of manual labor, but rather the soft, maintained look of someone who had been raised in comfort. Most tellingly, she saw the way the girl met her gaze without flinching, without the downcast eyes of deference or the challenging glare of defiance, but with a level, honest regard that suggested she was accustomed to being treated as an equal by those in positions of authority. Prince Elian had emerged from the shadows of the upper gallery, drawn by the commotion and the strange magnetic pull of the visitor's arrival. He looked down at the girl from the balustrade, his heart performing a slow, rhythmic thud against his ribs. He did not see a princess in the traditional sense. He saw a person who had been thoroughly undone by the elements, someone who had been reduced to the very essence of survival. And yet, there was something in the way she stood, a lack of apology, a quiet acceptance of her own vulnerability, that moved him more than any of the choreographed displays of the foreign courts. He had watched dozens of princesses make their entrances into throne rooms and banquet halls, each arrival calculated for maximum impact. They would sweep in surrounded by retinues, their gowns designed to catch the light in specific ways, their movements rehearsed, to convey just the right balance of confidence and humility. This girl had arrived alone, soaked and shivering, yet somehow her presence felt more authentic than any of those carefully staged performances. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to shield her, not from the rain, which had already done its work, but from the judging eyes of the court that were already beginning to gather in the periphery. He could see the servants whispering among themselves, and he could imagine the gossip that would spread through the castle by morning. The thought filled him with a protective anger he had not felt in years, a desire to defend this stranger from the casual cruelty of those who would dismiss her based on her appearance alone. The queen turned to the head housekeeper, a woman as stern and efficient as the castle walls. "Prepare the guest chamber in the tall tower," the queen commanded, her voice carrying a weight that brooked no question. "The one with the 20 mattresses of eiderdown and the 20 feather beds of the finest silk." The housekeeper paused, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, for that room was reserved for the most esteemed of visitors, and its preparation was a labor of hours, involving the layering of endless bedding. She opened her mouth as if to question the order, then thought better of it, and simply nodded, her mind already calculating the logistics of what would be required to prepare the chamber on such short notice. The room in question had not been used in nearly 2 years, not since the visit of the ambassador from the Eastern Confederation, and it would need to be aired, cleaned, and stocked with fresh linens. "And," the queen added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "bring me a single dried garden pea from the pantry." The request was so bizarre, so utterly removed from the urgency of the girl's condition, that a ripple of confusion moved through the servants. The housekeeper's eyes widened fractionally, and she exchanged a quick glance with one of the senior maids, both women clearly wondering if they had misheard or if the queen had finally succumbed to some form of eccentricity. But the queen's word was law, and the machinery of the household began to turn. The servants dispersed with the efficiency born of long practice, some hurrying toward the kitchens, others climbing the stairs toward the tower chamber that would require hours of preparation. As the girl was led away to be bathed and dried, the queen retreated to the kitchens, her movements purposeful and secret. The kitchen was a vast, warm space dominated by the great hearth, where the cooking fires burned day and night. The head cook, a woman who had served the castle for 3 decades, looked up in surprise as the queen entered her domain. Royalty rarely ventured into the working areas of the castle, and the cook quickly set down the copper pot she had been polishing and wiped her hands on her apron, uncertain how to respond to this unusual visit. The queen moved past her without explanation, making her way to the pantry where the dried goods were stored in labeled jars and bins. She took the small hard pea and held it in the palm of her hand. To any other observer, it was a piece of refuse, a shriveled seed of no value. But to the queen, it was a diagnostic tool, a tiny, unrelenting point of reality. She believed that a true princess, a person of ultimate and crystalline sensitivity, would be unable to ignore the presence of even the smallest discordance. The idea had come to her years ago during a conversation with a traveling philosopher who had argued that the nobility of the soul could be measured by the fineness of its perceptions, that those who were truly refined would feel the imperfections of the world in ways that ordinary people could not. The philosopher had been speaking metaphorically, but the queen had taken the concept and transformed it into a practical test. If this girl was who she claimed to be, her physical being would be so finely tuned that the infinitesimal pressure of the pea would be felt through every layer of luxury. It was a test not of character, but of the very fiber of her existence, a test of whether she was real in the way Elian so desperately needed her to be. The queen understood that the test was absurd by conventional standards, that any rational person would dismiss it as the whim of a mind too removed from practical reality to make sound judgments. But she also knew that the conventional standards had failed her son, that the normal methods of evaluation, lineage, wealth, education, beauty, had proven useless in identifying the quality he sought. This required a different approach, one that measured something the world had no other way to quantify. The preparation of the bed became a ritual of silent, focused intensity. The servants moved like shadows through the tower chamber, hauling the heavy mattresses of wool and horsehair, followed by the lighter, more opulent layers of swan's down and silk. The work was backbreaking, requiring the strength of multiple people to maneuver each mattress up the narrow spiral staircase. The bed grew higher and higher, rising toward the vaulted ceiling like a monument to comfort. Each layer was carefully positioned, smoothed, and aligned, the servants working with the precision of architects constructing a delicate structure. It was a mountain of softness, a vertical landscape of quilted velvet and brocade. The chamber itself was circular, occupying the entire top floor of the eastern tower. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes, and the windows were tall and narrow, designed to let in light, while minimizing the drafts that plagued the higher elevations of the castle. A fire had been lit in the hearth, and the room was gradually warming, though the stone walls still held the chill of the storm. At the very bottom, beneath the first and heaviest mattress, the queen herself placed the pea, positioning it dead center upon the wooden slats. She smoothed the fabric with a hand that did not tremble, her mind calculating the physics of the test with a cold, analytical grace. She was not being cruel, she was being desperate, hoping to find, for her son's sake, a soul that had not been calloused by the world. She thought of all the other tests she might have devised, all the questions she might have asked or challenges she might have presented, and she knew that none of them would have revealed what she needed to know. Words could be rehearsed, actions could be performed, but the body's involuntary response to discomfort could not be faked. Elian stood in the doorway as the final layers were smoothed into place. He watched the process with a mixture of fascination and a growing sense of dread. The philosopher had been speaking metaphorically, but the queen had taken the concept and transformed it into a practical test. If this girl was who she claimed to be, her physical being would be so finely tuned that the infinitesimal pressure of the pea would be felt through every layer of luxury. It was a test not of character, but of the very fiber of her existence, a test of whether she was real in the way Elian so desperately needed her to be. The queen understood that the test was absurd by conventional standards, that any rational person would dismiss it as the whim of a mind, too removed from practical reality to make sound judgments. But she also knew that the conventional standards had failed her son, that the normal methods of evaluation, lineage, wealth, education, beauty, had proven useless in identifying the quality he sought. This required a different approach, one that measured something the world had no other way to quantify. The preparation of the bed became a ritual of silent, focused intensity. The servants moved like shadows through the tower chamber, hauling the heavy mattresses of wool and horsehair, followed by the lighter, more opulent layers of swan's down and silk. The work was backbreaking, requiring the strength of multiple people to maneuver each mattress up the narrow spiral staircase. The bed grew higher and higher, rising toward the vaulted ceiling like a monument to comfort. Each layer was carefully positioned, smoothed, and aligned, the servants working with the precision of architects constructing a delicate structure. It was a mountain of softness, a vertical landscape of quilted velvet and brocade. The chamber itself was circular, occupying the entire top floor of the eastern tower. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes, and the windows were tall and narrow, designed to let in light, while minimizing the drafts that plagued the higher elevations of the castle. A fire had been lit in the hearth, and the room was gradually warming, though the stone walls still held the chill of the storm. At the very bottom, beneath the first and heaviest mattress, the queen herself placed the pea, positioning it dead center upon the wooden slats. She smoothed the fabric with a hand that did not tremble, her mind calculating the physics of the test with a cold, analytical grace. She was not being cruel, she was being desperate, hoping to find, for her son's sake, a soul that had not been calloused by the world. She thought of all the other tests she might have devised, all the questions she might have asked or challenges she might have presented, and she knew that none of them would have revealed what she needed to know. Words could be rehearsed, actions could be performed, but the body's involuntary response to discomfort could not be faked. Elian stood in the doorway as the final layers were smoothed into place. He watched the process with a mixture of fascination and a growing sense of dread. There was something haunting about the image, the girl in white climbing toward the ceiling, disappearing into the vast soft clouds of the mattresses. Each step seemed to require enormous effort, her legs shaking slightly, from the combination of exhaustion and the residual cold that still gripped her body. She reached the top and lay down, her body sinking into the layers of down. For a moment, she simply lay there, eyes closed, and Elian thought she might fall asleep immediately, her body finally succumbing to the overwhelming fatigue of her journey. The servants extinguished the candles one by one, until the only light came from the dying embers in the hearth, and the occasional distant flash of lightning that seeped through the heavy curtains. The shadows in the room grew longer and deeper, transforming the chamber into a place that existed somewhere between the waking world and the realm of dreams. The queen stood for a moment at the foot of the bed, her silhouette sharp against the dim light, before she turned and walked past Elian without a word. Her face was a mask of expectation, a silent sentinel waiting for the verdict of the dawn. As she passed her son in the doorway, she paused briefly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm in a gesture of solidarity. No words were exchanged, but in that touch Elian felt the weight of his mother's hope and the depth of her understanding. The castle began to settle into the deep, rhythmic breathing of the night. The storm outside had not ceased, but it had transitioned into a steady, hypnotic drone, the sound of a world being relentlessly washed. The initial violence of the tempest had given way to a more persistent, methodical rainfall that seemed as though it might continue forever. In the kitchens, the fires were banked and the heavy copper pots hung silent. The cooks and scullery maids had long since retreated to their quarters, leaving behind a space that smelled of bread and herbs, with only the occasional pop of a settling log to break the silence. In the barracks, the guards leaned against their spears, their heads nodding in the gloom. The night watch had been doubled because of the storm, but even the most vigilant men found their eyes growing heavy. As the hours stretched toward morning, in the stables, the horses shifted in their stalls, their breath misting in the cool air. They stood in the darkness, occasionally snorting or stamping, their animal awareness attuned to the atmospheric pressure that still hung over the kingdom like a physical presence. The great machinery of the kingdom had paused, suspended in the tension between the arrival of the stranger and the revelation of the morning. Every person within the walls, whether they knew the details of the test or not, felt the strange sense of anticipation that had settled over Oakhaven, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. The prince did not go to his own chambers. He sat in a window nook halfway up the tower stairs, listening to the wind and the ancient creaking bones of the castle. The nook was one of his favorite places, a small alcove, with a cushioned seat and a view of the Western Valley. He had spent countless hours there as a child, reading by candlelight, or simply watching the seasons change across the landscape. He thought about the girl lying atop her mountain of silk. He wondered if she was dreaming of the roads she had traveled, of the kingdom she had left behind, or of the storm that had driven her to their gates. He wondered if she felt the silence of Oakhaven as a relief or as a burden. He tried to imagine what would drive a princess, if that's truly what she was, to travel alone through such dangerous weather without the protection of guards or the comfort of a proper carriage. But most of all, he wondered about the pea. He imagined it sitting there, a tiny, stubborn dot of reality at the base of the tower. He imagined the way it might radiate a subtle, invisible pressure upward, moving through the wool, the horsehair, the foam, and the feathers, searching for a nervous system delicate enough to receive its message. The thought seemed to border on magical thinking, the kind of irrational belief that he normally dismissed as superstition. It was a ridiculous thought, a product of a mind overwrought by loneliness, yet he could not shake the feeling that the entire future of the crown was currently resting on the sensitivity of a single shivering back. He thought about the philosophical implications of the test, about whether sensitivity was truly a measure of worth or merely a biological variation that had no bearing on character. He wondered if his mother's theory was based on genuine insight, or simply the desperate need to find some rational framework for understanding the ineffable quality she sought. In the tower room, the darkness was absolute. The girl lay still, her eyes closed, her breath slow and shallow. The world around her was a cocoon of the finest textures human wealth could provide. The air was still, the temperature perfect, the silence profound. Everything in her environment was designed to facilitate the total erasure of the self into sleep. The mattresses beneath her formed a landscape of unprecedented softness, each layer specifically chosen for its ability to cradle the human form and distribute weight in a way that minimized pressure points. Under normal circumstances, a weary traveler would have succumbed instantly, falling into a dreamless void that would last until the sun struck the stones. The exhaustion that gripped her body should have been enough to override any minor discomfort, to drag her consciousness down into the depths of oblivion where the details of the physical world ceased to matter. But the Queen's test was not about the circumstances of the world. It was about the internal landscape of the sleeper. As the hours ticked by, the castle seemed to hold its breath, the very shadows in the corners of the room thickening with anticipation. The girl shifted slightly in her sleep, or what passed for sleep, her body trying to find a position that would bring relief. But no matter how she adjusted herself, no matter which way she turned, there remained a persistent point of pressure that her mind could not ignore. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible above the general fatigue. But as the minutes accumulated into hours, it grew into something impossible to dismiss. The queen in her own chambers did not sleep. She sat by her window, her hands clasped in her lap, watching the rain. The water streaked down the glass in endless rivulets, creating patterns that formed and dissolved with hypnotic regularity. She was thinking of her own youth and the many tests she had endured, not of mattresses and peas, but of words and silences, of the way she had been required to navigate the treacherous waters of the court without losing the core of her own perception. She had been the daughter of a minor duchess sent to the capital to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the previous queen. She had watched the courtiers perform their elaborate dances of ambition, had witnessed the way truth was negotiable and loyalty was conditional. She had learned to survive in that world by developing an acute sensitivity to the unspoken currents that moved beneath every conversation. She could detect a lie not by the words spoken, but by the fractional hesitation that preceded them, could sense betrayal in the angle of a shoulder, or the particular quality of a smile. She knew that the world was becoming a louder, coarser place, a place where the loudest voice was mistaken for the truest, and where the thickest skin was praised as the greatest strength. She had watched kingdoms rise on the backs of men who valued conquest over understanding, who measured success in territory claimed rather than wisdom gained. She had seen the arts decline as patrons favored spectacle over substance, had witnessed the slow erosion of the kind of quiet contemplation that she believed was essential to a civilized society. She wanted, more than anything, to prove that she was not the last of her kind. She wanted to know that the refinement she had cultivated in Elian was not a dead end, but a bridge to a new kind of understanding. She imagined a future where Oakhaven could stand as a beacon, a place that demonstrated that there was value in sensitivity, that the ability to perceive the world's subtle textures was not a weakness, but the foundation of genuine wisdom. The prince, still sitting on the stairs, felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. He felt the history of Oakhaven, with all its quiet dignity and its hidden sorrows. The castle had stood for 7 generations, each monarch adding their own layer to its architecture and philosophy, building it slowly into what it had become. He thought of his grandfather, who had established the Royal Library and had invited scholars from across the continent to come and debate philosophy. He thought of his great-grandmother, who had been a painter of such skill that her portraits were said to capture not just the appearance of their subjects, but something of their essential nature. He felt the presence of the girl above him, a mystery wrapped in wet linen and mud. He tried to imagine what her life had been before tonight, what kind of kingdom she had come from, and what had driven her to leave it. He wondered if she had felt as out of place in her own home as he felt in his, if she had spent her days searching for someone who might understand the particular way she experienced the world. He found himself hoping, with a fervency that surprised him, that she would not sleep well. It was a cruel wish to hope for another's discomfort. But in the inverted logic of this night, a restless night was the only path to a shared future. If she slept soundly, she would be just another girl, a survivor of the storm who would be given a dry set of clothes and a bag of coins, before being sent back out into the world to find a life that did not involve him. But if she stayed awake, if she felt the pea, then he would no longer be alone in his perception of the world's jagged edges. Then he would have proof that his sensitivity was not an aberration, but a real capacity that others might share. Then there would be hope for a future that did not feel like a slow march toward emotional extinction. The storm began to lose its fury as the clock struck the deepest hour of the night. The rain softened into a fine silver mist that clung to the trees like a shroud. The wind died down to a low, mournful sigh that wandered through the corridors. The violence of the tempest had exhausted itself, leaving behind only this gentle, persistent dampness that seemed as though it might last until the end of time. Inside the guest chamber, the girl shifted slightly. She did not wake, but a small frown creased her brow in the darkness. Her hands clenched and unclenched, her fingers grasping at the silk sheets. as if trying to find purchase against some invisible discomfort. Her breathing remained steady but shallow, the rhythm of someone whose body was desperate for rest but whose nervous system refused to surrender. The pea, small and insignificant as it was, remained where it had been placed, an unyielding point of truth beneath the 40 layers of luxury. It did not move, it did not change, and it did not soften. It simply existed, a silent witness to the nature of the woman who lay above it. It was a dried garden pea harvested the previous summer and stored in the pantry for use in winter soups. It had no special properties, no magical qualities, yet in the context of the Queen's test, it had been transformed into an instrument of revelation, a tool for measuring, something that could be measured in no other way. The household remained suspended in this state of quiet uncertainty, waiting for the light to return and the story to resume. The silence of the castle was now total, the kind of silence that feels as though it has a physical weight. It was the silence of a theater before the curtain rises, the silence of a forest before the first bird sings. Every person within the walls, the queen, the prince, the servants, and the guest, was bound together by a single unspoken question that would only be answered by the morning. The night stretched on, each hour marked by the tolling of the clock tower that rose above the castle's central courtyard. The mechanism was ancient, maintained by a master clockmaker, who had inherited the position from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The chimes rang out across the sleeping kingdom, a reminder that time continued its march, regardless of human hopes or fears. But for now, there was only the dark, the cooling embers, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the kingdom's heart. The prince leaned his head against the cold stone wall and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen to the night one last time before it ended. He could hear the rain, softer now but still present, a gentle percussion against the slate roofs and stone walkways. He could hear the distant sound of the guards changing shifts, the muffled footsteps and low voices carrying through the corridors. He could hear the castle itself, the ancient groaning of timber and stone, the settling of foundations that had borne the weight of centuries. High above, in the mountain of bedding, the princess lay in the dark, and the pea waited, and the world remained for a few hours longer, undecided, shimmering, and strange. The girl opened her eyes in the darkness, though she could see nothing. She stared up at where she knew the ceiling must be, her mind caught between exhaustion and a growing sense of unease. She had traveled for weeks to reach this kingdom, had crossed mountains and forests, had survived bandits and storms, and through it all, she had managed to find rest wherever she stopped. She had slept on the ground beneath stars, in barns surrounded by animals, in roadside inns where the beds were little more than straw pallets. But here, in this palace of comfort, surrounded by more luxury than she had ever encountered, sleep eluded her completely. She thought perhaps it was the strangeness of her situation, the vulnerability of arriving as she had, bedraggled and alone. She thought perhaps it was the weight of claiming her title in front of skeptical guards, the fear that she would be dismissed as a fraud. But beneath these surface anxieties, there was something else, something physical and impossible to ignore. There was a point of pressure against her back, a small, insistent wrongness that seemed to radiate outward through her entire body, making every position uncomfortable. She shifted again, rolling onto her side, but the sensation followed her, manifesting in her hip, her shoulder, her ribs. It was as if the bed itself was rejecting her, as if the mountain of softness was concealing something hard and unforgiving. She considered climbing down and examining the mattresses, but the thought of navigating the ladder in complete darkness, of explaining to servants in the morning why she had dismantled their careful work, made her remain where she was, enduring the discomfort with growing frustration. The dawn did not break over the kingdom of Oakhaven with a triumphant burst of gold. Instead, it arrived as a slow, hesitant filtration of gray light, creeping over the saturated hills and seeping through the heavy tapestries of the castle windows. The world outside was transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that looked as though it had been scrubbed raw. The trees stood stark against the pale sky, their leaves battered and scattered, their branches still dripping with the residue of the night's deluge. The mist clung to the valleys like a damp woolen shroud, and the only sound was the rhythmic, heavy drip of rainwater from the eaves of the tower. The castle began to wake slowly, reluctantly, as if emerging from a particularly vivid dream. Inside the citadel, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and the faint, lingering trail of the rosemary bathwater from the night before. The servants began their morning routines with unusual quietness, moving through the halls with a subdued energy that reflected the strange tension that still hung over the household. The morning was a fragile thing, held together by the collective breath of a household that had spent the night in a state of suspended animation. The cook began preparing breakfast with mechanical precision, cracking eggs and kneading dough while her mind wandered to the mysterious guest sleeping in the tower room. Prince Elian had not moved from his perch on the tower stairs. He had watched the shadows shift and lengthen, tracking the passage of time by the slow rotation of the stars that occasionally peered through the breaking clouds. His body was stiff from sitting in one position for so long, his muscles protesting as he shifted his weight. His mind was a labyrinth of possibilities, each one more delicate than the last. He thought of the girl in the room above, the stranger who claimed a title that her bedraggled appearance seemed to refute. He thought of the pea, that tiny hard kernel of judgment buried deep within the silk. In the cold clarity of the morning, the test felt almost absurdly fragile, yet he knew it was the only metric that mattered in a kingdom built on the invisible. He felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest, a mixture of hope and the fear of disappointment. He was a man who had traveled the world and found it lacking in depth. If the girl above him had slept through the night, he would be forced to accept that perhaps his own sensitivity was a curse rather than a gift, that he was destined to spend his life alone in his perceptions, unable to find another soul who experienced reality with the same intensity. The queen was the first to move through the halls with purpose. She emerged from her chambers as the first true ray of sunlight, managed to pierce the mist, appearing as a figure of silver and iron. Her gown, a deep slate blue, didn't rustle as she walked. She moved with a silence that suggested she was part of the architecture itself. She had dressed with particular care this morning, understanding that the coming hours would be significant regardless of their outcome. Her hair was arranged in the elaborate style of formal occasions, and she wore the sapphire pendant that had been a wedding gift from the king, though she rarely bothered with such displays of wealth. She found Elian on the stairs and placed a cool, dry hand on his shoulder. No words were exchanged between them, for they shared a vocabulary of silence that was more articulate than any speech. In that touch, she conveyed understanding, support, and shared apprehension. Together, they moved toward the guest chamber, followed at a respectful distance by the head housekeeper and two maids carrying trays of steaming tea and honeyed bread. The trays were set with the finest porcelain, delicate cups, painted with scenes of pastoral tranquility, and small silver spoons that caught the morning light. The ritual of the morning was beginning, but its usual rhythm was underscored by a tension that made the very air seem to hum. The servants exchanged glances but said nothing, their professional discretion preventing them from voicing the questions that occupied all their minds. They reached the door of the tower room and paused. The queen signaled for the servants to wait, and she turned the heavy iron handle herself. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing the mountain of mattresses, bathed in the pale, cool light of the morning. The room was silent, save for the soft sound of breathing. The young woman was already awake. She was sitting up at the very summit of the bedding, her back against the carved headboard, her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller than she had the night before, framed by the vast expanse of white linen and the towering heights of the eiderdown. Her face was pale, and there were dark, bruised circles beneath her eyes that spoke of a struggle far more profound than mere travel weariness. Her hair, though it had been carefully brushed the night before, was disheveled from hours of restless movement. She did not look at the queen first, but at Elian, and in that look he saw a reflection of his own exhaustion. It was not the look of a guest who had been refreshed by a night of luxury. It was the look of someone who had been through a long and arduous trial. There was something raw in her expression, a vulnerability that came from having been pushed beyond the limits of endurance. "Good morning, child," the queen said, her voice neutral and smooth as polished glass. "We trust the storm did not disturb your rest, and that the comforts of Oakhaven were sufficient for your needs." The girl was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the mist was slowly burning away under the rising sun. She seemed to be searching for words that were not complaints, words that could describe an experience that felt both impossible and undeniable. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised one to push the hair from her face, and Elian noticed that her fingers were clenched, as if she had spent the night holding on to something for support. The storm was a distant thing, she began, her voice low and textured with fatigue. I heard the wind, and I heard the stones of the castle whispering to the rain, but I cannot say that I rested. The queen tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. The mattresses were of the finest quality, were they not? 20 layers of eiderdown and 20 of the softest silk. Surely such a bed is the height of human comfort. The girl looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the patterns of the quilt. It was very soft, she whispered. But it was as if the softness itself was a lie. I felt as though I were lying on a mountain that was hiding a secret. No matter how I turned, no matter how I tried to settle my weight, there was something, a pressure, a sharpness, that would not let me be. Elian took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat. His heart was pounding with an intensity that surprised him, a mixture of hope and something approaching joy that he had not felt in years. The girl continued, her voice gaining a slight trembling strength. It was a tiny thing, I am sure, perhaps a knot in the wood or a stray feather, that had turned to iron in the night, but it felt as though I were being pressed against a stone. My body feels as though it has been marked by a hardship I cannot see. I spent the hours of darkness listening to my own heartbeat, unable to find the peace that the room seemed to promise. She looked up then, her eyes swimming with a quiet, bewildered honesty. I am sorry, you have been so kind to a stranger, and I must seem ungrateful to find fault with such a magnificent bed. But I have not closed my eyes for a single moment. I feel as though I have been bruised by the very air itself. Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together, clearly fighting to maintain her composure in front of these strangers. The queen turned toward Elian, and for the first time in years, he saw a genuine smile touch the corners of her mouth. It was not a smile of triumph, but of profound, quiet relief. It was the smile of someone who had taken a tremendous risk and found their faith validated, who had hoped for something that seemed impossible and discovered it was real. She reached out and took the girl's hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. There is no need for apology, the queen said softly. In this house, we value the truth of the body over the politeness of the tongue. You have felt what was meant to be felt, and in doing so, you have told us more about yourself than any lineage could. The queen signaled to the maids, who hurried forward to help the guest descend from the high, silk-covered mountain. As the girl climbed down the ladder, her movements were stiff and careful, the movements of someone who was truly physically aching. She winced as her feet touched the floor, and she had to steady herself against the bedpost for a moment, her legs unsteady from the combination of exhaustion and relief. They led her down to the solarium, a room of glass and light that looked out over the dripping gardens and the stone walls of the outer ward. The solarium was the queen's favorite room in the entire castle, a space she had designed herself when she first came to Oakhaven. It was filled with plants from across the kingdom, exotic ferns and flowering vines that created a sense of being in a garden even in the depths of winter. The breakfast was laid out, bread, fruit, and small cakes, but the food was secondary to the atmosphere of dawning recognition. The table was set with simple elegance, white linens and fresh flowers from the greenhouse, and the windows had been opened to let in the cool, rain-washed air of the morning. Elian sat across from her, watching the way she held her teacup, with a delicacy that was not learned but inherent. He saw the way she winced slightly as she leaned back against the chair, and he felt a surge of empathy so strong it was almost dizzying. He realized that her beauty was not a matter of features or form, but of this terrifying, beautiful transparency. She was a person for whom the world was not a blunt instrument, but a series of subtle, often painful vibrations. He could see it in the way she responded to the morning light. The slight squint that suggested the brightness was almost too much. He could see it in the way she startled slightly when one of the maids dropped a spoon, the sound clearly registering at a volume that others in the room did not perceive. "Who are you?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. The girl looked at him, her eyes clear and steady despite her exhaustion. "I am the daughter of a king whose realm is far to the north, a place of ice and long silences," she said. "I left because I was told that the world was wide and full of wonders, But I found that most people see only the surface of things. They see the mud on my cloak and assume I am the mud. They see the rain and think only of their own discomfort. I have been searching for a place where I would not have to explain why the wind feels like a knife or why a lie feels like a weight in the room. She paused, taking a slow, cautious sip of her tea. The warmth of the liquid seemed to bring her some comfort, and a trace of color returned to her cheeks. Last night, I thought I had found another place of surfaces, but this morning, looking at you, I think perhaps I was wrong. Elian felt a weight he hadn't known he was carrying begin to lift. The silence of Oakhaven, which had always felt like a burden of loneliness, suddenly felt like a shared sanctuary. He saw in her the same quiet longing that had driven him to the edges of the world, the same refusal to accept a life of dull, unfeeling surfaces. He recognized in her eyes the particular quality of awareness that he had spent his life searching for in others, the sense that she was experiencing the moment not just superficially, but with every fiber of her being. The Queen watched them both, her sharp mind already weaving the future into the tapestry of the kingdom's history. She knew that the marriage of two such people would not be easy. The world is a harsh place for those who feel the pressure of a pea through 40 mattresses. They would struggle with the coarseness of politics, would be wounded by the casual cruelties that others dismissed as necessary. They would find court life exhausting and would need to create spaces of quiet and solitude just to survive. But she also knew that their union would be the only thing that could preserve the soul of Oakhaven. Together, they could build something that stood against the tide of increasing brutality and thoughtlessness, a kingdom that valued perception over power. The morning progressed with a slow, deliberate grace. The sun rose higher, burning away the last of the mist, and revealing a world that was sparkling and new. The gardens, though battered by the storm, seemed to have been renewed. By the violence of the rain, the colors more vivid, the air clearer than it had been in weeks. The pea was retrieved from beneath the mattresses, a small, insignificant thing that was now destined for a place of honor in the royal treasury, encased in a locket of golden crystal. The Queen herself oversaw its placement, handling the dried seed with a reverence that would have seemed absurd to anyone who did not understand its significance. It would become a symbol for the kingdom, a reminder that the truth is often found in the smallest, most hidden places, and that sensitivity is not a weakness, but the ultimate form of discernment. The locket was commissioned from the finest jeweler in the capital, a master craftsman who specialized in creating pieces that honored significant moments in the kingdom's history. The guest, whose name was Serafina, was given a room on the ground floor, where the windows looked out at the level of the roses, and the bed was made of simple, honest linen without the trickery of eiderdown. The room was smaller than the tower chamber, but infinitely more comfortable, with furnishings that were beautiful without being ostentatious. There was a writing desk by the window, a comfortable chair by the fireplace, and shelves lined with books that the Queen had personally selected, based on her first impressions of their guest. As the days turned into weeks, the melancholy that had gripped the castle began to soften into something more productive, something akin to a long, peaceful afternoon. The servants noticed the change first, the way the prince began to emerge from his self-imposed isolation, the way his step became lighter and his expression less haunted. Elian and Serafina spent their time in the library or walking through the woods, often in a silence that was neither empty nor strained. They were two people who had found a common language in the nuances of the world. They noticed the way the light changed before a storm, and the way the birdsong varied with the temperature of the air. They found that they did not need the grand gestures or the theatrical declarations that characterized the courts they had both fled. Their connection was built on the quiet recognition of shared truth, a slow-burning fire that warmed the castle from the inside out. Elian showed her his favorite places in the castle, the hidden alcoves and forgotten corridors that he had discovered during his years of wandering the halls alone. He took her to the highest tower, where on clear days you could see 3 neighboring kingdoms spread out like a map. He introduced her to the old librarian, a scholar who had been his tutor, and who still maintained the archives with meticulous care. Serafina, in turn, shared stories of her own kingdom, of the long winters when the sun barely rose above the horizon, and the northern lights painted the sky in colors that defied description. She spoke of her family, of a father who ruled justly but without understanding, who could not comprehend why his daughter found the court overwhelming. She described her decision to leave, the growing sense that she would suffocate if she remained in a place where no one seemed to truly see her. The wedding, when it finally arrived, was not a spectacle of noise and vanity. It took place in the castle chapel at dusk, when the light was at its most contemplative and the shadows were long. The chapel itself was a small, intimate space, built in the early days of the kingdom and maintained with the same reverence as the royal library. There were no trumpets, only the sound of a single lute, playing a melody that seemed to rise out of the stones themselves. The musician was an old man who had served the castle for 40 years, and he played a composition that had been written specifically for the occasion, a piece that captured the quiet joy of the moment. Serafina wore a dress of pale, unadorned silk that looked like moonlight, and Alien wore the simple velvet of his station. The dress had been made by the castle's seamstress, a woman who had listened carefully to Serafina's preferences and created something that honored her natural grace, without overwhelming it with unnecessary embellishment. When they exchanged their vows, it was in voices that were steady and low, promising not just to rule, but to listen to each other and to the world that spoke to them in whispers. The words they spoke were not the traditional vows of duty and allegiance, but promises they had written themselves, commitments to honor each other's perceptions and to build a life that valued truth above all else. The king and queen stood by, the king nodding with a newfound respect for the path his son had chosen, and the queen looking on with the satisfaction of a master gardener seeing a rare flower finally bloom. The king, who had initially been skeptical of the entire affair, had come to recognize in Serafina a strength that was different from but equal to the strength he valued. The celebration that followed was a feast of subtle flavors and quiet conversation. The people of Oakhaven, who had long sensed the prince's distance, now felt a new kind of warmth emanating from the citadel. They saw in the new princess a woman who looked them in the eye, with a profound, unblinking clarity, a woman who seemed to see the effort in their work and the hope in their hearts. She made it a practice to visit the village regularly, not with the performative charity that characterized some royals, but with genuine interest in the lives of the people she now served. The kingdom began to change, becoming a place where the arts flourished, and where the pace of life slowed to match the rhythm of the seasons. It became known as a realm of deep peace, a sanctuary for those who felt the world too keenly and needed a place where their sensitivity was valued as the highest form of wisdom. Artists and poets began to migrate to Oakhaven, drawn by rumors of a court that actually appreciated their work. In the years that followed, the story of the Pea became a legend, passed down through generations of Oakhaven's children. But it was not told as a story of a prince finding a bride. It was told as a story about the importance of being real. It was a reminder that the most significant things in life are often the ones that are the hardest to see, and that the quality of one's soul is revealed in the moments when one is most vulnerable. Elian and Serafina lived a long and quiet life, their hair turning to the color of the morning mist they had both once watched. From the windows of the tower, they ruled with a gentle wisdom that transformed Oakhaven into a model for neighboring kingdoms, a place where disputes were resolved through careful listening rather than displays of force. They remained, until the very end, people of the interior, guardians of the subtle and the true. They established schools where children were taught not just facts, but how to pay attention, how to notice the world with all their senses. On the final night of their story, many years later, the kingdom was once again visited by a gentle, steady rain. The elderly King Elian and Queen Serafina sat by their hearth, the firelight casting a warm, amber glow over the room. The castle was silent, but it was no longer a silence of melancholy. It was a silence of completion, of a long task well finished. They looked at each other, and in the depths of their eyes, there was still that spark of recognition that had ignited on a stormy night. So many decades ago, there was no need for words, for they had spent a lifetime speaking to each other in the language of the quiet. Serafina reached out and took Elian's hand, her skin now as delicate and translucent as fine parchment. "The world is very quiet tonight," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "It is," Elian replied, his voice a low, steady anchor. The rain is washing the world, and the stars are waiting behind the clouds. They sat there together, two souls who had found their way through the mattresses of the world to the single, hard truth at the center. They felt the peace of those who no longer have anything to prove, who have been tested and found to be entirely, beautifully real. The household settled into its nightly rest, the servants moving with the practiced and respectful quiet that had become the hallmark of Oakhaven. The fires were dimmed and the great doors were barred against the cool, damp air. In the treasury, the pea in its golden locket sat in the darkness, a small, silent witness to the history it had helped to write. It remained a point of stillness in a changing world, a symbol of the power of a single, unyielding perception. And in the royal chambers, the king and queen finally closed their eyes, falling into a sleep that was deep, undisturbed, and profoundly earned. The storm outside eventually faded into a soft, melodic drizzle, and the moon made a brief appearance through the thinning clouds, casting a silver light over the sleeping kingdom. Oakhaven was a place of rest now, a place where the night was not a time of fear, but a time of inward listening. The story of the prince and the princess, of the storm and the mattress, had reached its natural, quiet conclusion. There was no more longing, no more searching, and no more doubt. There was only the stillness, the darkness, and the absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The world continued its slow, deliberate turn. But for one small kingdom, the search for truth was finally over. As the last candle in the castle was extinguished, a sense of grace seemed to settle over the stones and the hills. The night was a vast, dark velvet, wrapping the inhabitants of Oakhaven in a dreamless, peaceful embrace. The memory of the storm was nothing more than a ghost, a distant echo that only served to make the current silence more precious. In the heart of the citadel, in the heart of the kingdom, and in the hearts of the two people who had found each other, against all odds, there was a profound and unwavering stillness. The test was finished, the recognition was complete, and the story was, at last, at rest. You've reached the end of our story. If this time felt calming or comforting, you're always welcome back here at the Sleep Wizards Library. Your support in any form helps keep these quiet stories alive. Thank you for listening, and may the rest of your night be gentle and unhurried.